There's something about social media campaigning that gets treated as like a magical black box, when the reality is we're just doing the modern version of what's always been done. We're trying to make the complex simple, make the boring interesting. And the tools we use are Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter. These days it's TikTok and Instagram Reels. But it's really just storytelling, and that's really what we do. We run a weird business. I used to work for the New Zealand Prime Minister, and my co-founder was head of the youth wing of the National Party of New Zealand, which is not a great way to pick people up in a bar if you introduce yourself like that. But, we've both been political tragics our whole lives, and we joined forces way back in 2016, which is a pretty interesting time. We had Trump winning his election. We had, the Brexit referendum. Social media was described as a pretty powerful force in both of those moments. And we thought this was a really interesting time to start thinking more about the role of social media in politics. So we set up a company to do exactly that. We've worked on about 20 different election campaigns around the world since then, here in the UK, in Australia, in New Zealand, and lots of other places as well. In 2019, we were fortunate enough to have worked with the Liberal Party in Australia in their winning election that sort of saw Scott Morrison win what was described as an unwinnable election earlier that year. And obviously the UK and Australia have long been close friends on this sort of stuff, and we got invited over by Isaac Levido, the campaign director, to do the same here.
And what was his pitch at the time? What did he say to you? Look, I need you to win this election. I need you to be looking at digital campaigns, being online. We're not that great at that. You guys can?
I think there's certainly before 2019, there was a real preconception that the Conservatives were pretty rubbish at social media, and that social media was something that the progressive side of politics was simply much better at. You'll remember in 2017, Labour and Momentum and Jeremy Corbyn just really wiped the floor with Theresa May's Conservatives on almost every metric in terms of that digital campaign. So the Conservatives knew how important social media was going to be, and they were willing to invest in it and invite us in to do that for them.
So talk us through what you did for them. I remember sort of reading at the time you bought more adverts on YouTube, Google, less focus on Twitter, a little bit less focus on things like Facebook. Was that just a sign of where the audience was going at that time? What were your sort of main strategies in 2019, how you were looking at different types of media?
Well, the thing with digital is it's always changing. The rules on each platform about the types of advertising you can buy are constantly changing, and especially after 2016, the type of ads you could run was drastically different in 2019 than in the preceding elections. And we also saw, and I still believe this, that YouTube is massively underutilised by political campaigns the world over. And so we didn't want to just do what had traditionally been done, which is loads of Facebook ads, just promoted posts in the feed. Facebook's important. It still is the biggest social media platform in the UK in terms of monthly active users, but the reality is it's a more diverse game. There are more platforms that you've got to be, more places you've got to be having a conversation with voters. So we split our budget. We spent more on YouTube than any political party's ever spent. We did YouTube takeovers, for which I don't think you can even do anymore for political purposes. I think YouTube realised how powerful they were, and after we bought 2 of them in a row, and sort of meant that everyone who went to YouTube on, I think it was the second day out from the election and like the 4th day out from the election, sort of very close to polling day, anybody that went to YouTube would just see our 4-minute ad taking over the whole site, which was a pretty powerful way to get a lot of views of our message.
And obviously, like I say, you've just mentioned how poor the Conservatives' social media game was. Was this sort of election where that started to turn around and they started to get back on the front foot?
I think the Conservatives, in the 2015 election, that was described as the first digital election, and the team that worked on that did a great job at the time, which was very much about getting on Facebook. The problem is in 2017, they did the same strategy again, and the world had changed. And we knew that the Tories couldn't afford to do the same again in 2019. So it was a more visual election. Video had a really important part to play, and that's why we thought YouTube was an important place to tell those slightly longer form, more visually interesting stories. And we were really lucky in having as charismatic a communicator as Boris Johnson in 2019. We had a very clear, simple message of get Brexit done, and a very charismatic, energetic, Energizer Bunny messenger that was running around saying get Brexit done as many ways as you possibly could.
Now let's talk about that famous advert of the campaign, where your campaign digitally recreated the famous scene from Love Actually, where Keira Knightley's been serenaded by her husband and Boris Johnson's at the door saying this is why we need to get Brexit done. Who came up with that idea? How was it executed? And did it work?
Well, I think it definitely worked because we're talking about it today, and I don't think we remember any other ads from the campaign. So that's a win. It worked most of all because it was funny and entertaining. It was a novel concept, the Prime Minister reenacting a pop culture reference, but it also worked because it was relentlessly on message. Every single placard was saying vote Conservative, we need to get Brexit done. And that meant that if you were watching that video without audio, or if you were seeing it on a screen, in the next room, whatnot, you were still receiving the message.
Where did you get the idea?
So my business partner, Sean, is a real film tragic. He loves films, really into it. And he was really passionate about doing pop culture moments for the campaign. So actually right at the beginning of the campaign, we had the idea to do it. And it was in our folder of, okay, let's whip this out if we get a chance to.
And it was right at the end of the campaign that you guys did.
And we used it 2 days out. So it was originally put in the too hard basket of this is a bit ridiculous. And then when Rosina Allen-Khan did an all right version about halfway through the campaign, we thought, well, this is the end of it. We clearly won't be able to do it because it now looked like we were copying. And then in the final couple of days, Isaac, the campaign director, said to us, look, let's go for it, boys. Let's make this happen. So we had 24 hours from when we got the green light to make it happen to when we had to submit the video to the BBC to run as a party political broadcast.
Gosh.
Which was
not long.
A really calm and relaxing 24 hours, as I'm sure you can imagine. We had to do casting, we had to dress the set, we had to find a location where the Prime Minister could come without anybody knowing what he was doing.
And it got shared absolutely everywhere, and not just people that loved it, but people that hated it as well. So you got the attention that you were hoping that it got.
Exactly. And my favourite line was Hugh Grant was obviously campaigning against the government at the time, quite enthusiastically. And I think he might have even been on LBC when he said it. He was in an interview and he said it had quite high production value. It was quite good, actually, and it was probably paid for by Russian rubles. So, I agree with the first half of that. We bill in pounds, but I thought that was a high praise coming from the talent himself.
Sure. And so since then, obviously, digital campaigning has just got so much bigger. What changed in the 2024 election? And you obviously have said before you don't think any of them won the digital campaign there. Why do you think that?
I think what's interesting about the most recent election is it wasn't as clear-cut as previous campaigns. I think most people looking back at any of the numbers in 2017 would say that Labour won. In 2019, they'd say that the Tories won the digital campaign. And you look at things like view reach, you look at what was the memorable content, you look at engagement. In 2024, it was a bit of a mixed bag, and that basically reflects the fact that it's not all about a single platform these days. So Reform did a good job of getting their message out on TikTok. I think the Tories did reasonably well on Instagram, but particularly Rishi's account was really effective on Instagram, and Labour did better on Facebook. So it is a bit of a mixed bag, and that probably reflects the political environment that we're in now anyway.
And Nigel Farage and Reform are doing super well on TikTok right now, and Donald Trump obviously has just come back for a stunning win in the US. Should we be seeing that as the way that digital campaigning will continue in the next sort of few years?
Well, we're really bullish about TikTok at Topham Guerin. We've used it for a lot of our clients in the corporate space, but also in the campaigning space. It's been a key part of our recent successful election campaigns in Australia and New Zealand, where we worked with the New Zealand Prime Minister Christopher Luxon a year out from the most recent election to turn him into a TikTok personality. And I think it made him an even better communicator and politician by being able to authentically show up on platforms where people are engaging with content, having conversations about issues. You used to be a great politician if you could deliver a speech and people were being enthusiastic in the crowd. These days, the politicians of the future, or of the now, and the people that will go on to be the really successful PMs in the future are the ones that can do the same on social media.
And lastly, do we think someone like Elon Musk is going to have an influence on digital campaigning in the future? Obviously, he's got his fingers in many pies. He's involved in tech. He's now involved in government, very close to Donald Trump. Should we be watching that space?
Well, I mean, he was a key factor in the US election. Obviously his purchase of X had a pretty political purpose. And he was campaigning actively for Trump in Pennsylvania. He had his PAC that was donating a lot of money as well. And he personally was pretty active every day on the platform. I think Twitter is a unique and really, really powerful place for communications to happen. Remember the recent story about Labour activists going over to support the Dems. That wouldn't have happened. That story wouldn't have broken if it hadn't been for Twitter, because it was a screenshot of that LinkedIn post that then blew up on the platform. So Twitter is unique, and that's the only place where...
What you mean X?
Yeah, so I still have on my phone, I call it Twitter. I've renamed it, it's Twitter, so nice. I can't quite bring myself to admit it's X. I'm an old Twitter fanboy. But it's an amazing place where that there's nothing else like it. People talk about Blue Sky, they talk about Threads. None of those platforms have the same cultural impact as Twitter or X does, and they never will.
Did you go into Downing Street with Boris Johnson, with Dominic Cummings going, we're going to have an election at some point, and it's going to have to be about getting Brexit done?
Yeah, we knew we knew we had to actually get through this gridlock that we had on Brexit, and we knew the way to do that was going to probably be an election. It was very unlikely that we were going to be able to do so without an election. The challenge, of course, was there was no obvious path to an election. So that was our big challenge after the sort of things like prorogation and things like that didn't work out. The different avenues we were trying to do to get to get to an election had to be our top priority.
Jeremy Corbyn didn't want it, of course. The Labour Party famously at first didn't want it. They thought they're not going to win it. And you obviously had to completely change the law to make that happen. Eventually did.
Yeah, I mean, so the challenge at that point was it was in nobody's interest but us to have an election. We'd spent so long focused on our sort of public messaging of, from the day one we had Boris in schools, in hospitals, prisons, everywhere, police stations, looking at the priorities of where the public were. So we had a very strong message where you'd have the top of LBC, you go to the Commons, you'd see everybody arguing over Brexit, you'd see Boris at a hospital saying, we're going to get Brexit done, and then we're going to deliver on your public services. So we had a very clear message. With that message, we had good public support. We knew that people with us, we knew that people could see that despite the media saying, Boris is having these crazy rows with his own MPs and with prorogation, all those things, people could see that he was trying to actually deliver Brexit. He was trying to break through this gridlock. And we knew we had that support. But the problem in the House was just simply the fact that we didn't have the votes. We couldn't get to an election. And actually, the gridlock came undone was it was Dominic Cummings' idea to decide that we would just go in and, say every day, we're going to have an election, we're going to put that through and try and put pressure on Corbyn to refuse to have an election every single day if we had to, until they broke. Well, I think it was Chuka Umunna who was the great hero of Brexit, actually, in the end, because he convinced the Lib Dems to break and say, hey, we'll go for an election. And I think once that gets in the ecosystem, Labour have to move because they can't be the ones stopping that, and then the rest is history.
I didn't think I'd hear you praising Chuka Umunna.
I know, it surprised me, but it's superb job.
But look, obviously you were in charge of communications in Downing Street. It's a really tough job for anyone in any government to do. I think that the government now are finding it difficult with their communications. But look, you had a few hairy moments. Boris Johnson, if you remember, stole an ITV journalist's phone when he tried to put a Mirror front page, I believe, in front of him about A&E waiting times, people on trolleys. The Prime Minister, of course, famously hid in a fridge, running away from GMB. What was that like to deal with?
So there's two elements, particularly in a campaign of communications. You have media management, which is how are we doing today? What's our story? Are we winning that sort of battle of the airwaves today? And you have your strategic communications of, what are we trying to say over the long period of time? What's our sort of moral story to the country and why should they be with us? I think we were always very strong on the moral story that we had, which was get Brexit done and let's focus on the things that you care about, and all our actions reflected that. In a campaign, things do go wrong, though, because the speed that you're going at things, at the total variety, the interplay with the general public, with the media every day, you're going to have these incidents. And I think the core thing in my job and some of the people in the team was to stay cool and to understand when you needed to intervene and when something was a genuine issue that could impact on public opinion, or when it was just media noise from an excitable lobby looking for just some fun on a day on the bus. And things like hiding in the fridge, as amusing as it is. And I remember being sat in the office, coming out of the meeting and watching him going into the fridge with the ops team and thinking, why has he just gone into a fridge? Why has he walked into it? But, he was doing countless interviews. I think we told up it's probably the most anyone's ever done on a campaign trail in terms of interviews. So when we had things like Andrew Neil or the fridge situation where people are saying he's running away from scrutiny, the public could see that was nonsense because every time they turned the TV on the radio, they were seeing him being interviewed.
And one of those interviews was actually LBC, where one of the clips that went viral, I believe, was when Nick had asked him how many children he had. That was a difficult moment. How do you navigate that when you're trying to shape that narrative, when you're trying to talk about communications and trying to get your Brexit message across, and you've got this distraction from your point of view about communications and talking about how many kids you got?
I think with all campaigns, the core element is staying on message, because it is really hard. It always surprises politicians when we sit down and we do the research, and they'll have been saying, particular sound bites over and over again and being everywhere. And in the lobby, everyone will be bored to tears with certain sound bites, but actually most people haven't heard them. Most people aren't engaging in the general knockabout of politics, even in a campaign. So it's really important to stay on message and to frame the argument the way you want them to. Those sort of incidences it's fine in terms of the content itself, as long as it doesn't take you away from your core message, as long as it's not starting a whole chain of events, that becomes the story and that's all people hear, and they're not hearing your actual message. That's when it becomes a problem. So with all these things, we would spend a long time, prep sessions. We'd have various ways to try and navigate some of these issues, and it was all about going back onto message and talking about the things that people generally care about. And that's the dynamic of, is this something that just the media care about and they want to talk about, or is it something the public care about, in which case you have to tackle it and you have to be able to engage with that and take people with you, and hopefully your messaging should be answering many of those questions.
Was there a moment where you knew you'd won the election, or was it right up until that exit poll came in you thought there's a chance this could all go completely the wrong way for you? Because obviously looking back now, historic win, huge landslide, it was a great, by the history books, a good campaign.
We knew we'd won the campaign before it began.
Yeah.
The work we did from July to December on framing the argument, on it being about, this is someone who's done everything they can to solve this problem, and we now need you as the public to help him get through that, and then we can focus on your priorities, NHS, police, housing. We knew that we had won that, and it was a case of we just didn't need to make any mistakes on the campaign. We couldn't gift it to anybody. So it was about being disciplined, it was about staying on message, it was about reinforcing the work that we'd already done. Because the core thing in politics is your actions should match your words and your communications. And too often we see, I think, for example, the last government, one of the reasons they failed is because they would say things like, we're going to cut taxes, we're a tax-cutting government, we're going to fix the NHS, we're going to get immigration, both illegal and illegal, down. But the opposite happened in all of those cases. So when you're out campaigning, people think, well, I just don't agree with what you're doing. Well, with us, I think there's a genuine view of our actions and our rhetoric totally aligned. So that was the critical thing. So the campaign itself was about, let's not make mistakes. Let's be disciplined, let's get that right. You always make mistakes, but there are mistakes and there are mistakes.
Obviously, it wasn't hugely long time before it all came down for Boris Johnson, for yourself. Looking back at that time in government, any regrets? What do you look back on and go, I really wish I'd done differently? Or if anything at all?
There are lots of things you would do differently. I think in all walks of life, if you had the chance to do things over, there's things you change. I think my overriding feeling with it all is just one of regret and sadness that we had such an opportunity to reshape the country and provide the sort of change that people asked for in 2016, in 19, and again at the last election, and are continually not being given. And I think we had a team that was incredibly talented, with a leader that could have led the way in delivering that change, and we blew it. And I think we're seeing the consequences of that now, in the fact that anyone who spends time doing sort of public opinion research will see how unhappy, how despondent the electorate is, how it's getting so fragmented now. We're sort of seeing, obviously, the rise of reform and other such things because politicians aren't dealing with the challenges that are in front of them. So it was a huge missed opportunity.
And finally, obviously, just a quick word on the guys in Number 10 now, doing the job that you were doing. Are they getting the strategic comms right? Is missions, milestones, foundations, is that the right way to go? Do people get it? Because I don't know if they do. I
mean, I don't quite get that particular campaign slogans, but I have a huge amount of sympathy for the communicators in Downing Street. It's a really tough job, and often it is policy makers that will be setting this agenda, and it strikes me that I'm not sure how much the communications team are involved in that. You tend to find it's the structure of Downing Street that's often a problem. So you have, again, there's a lot of people focusing on media management, but it doesn't look to me that they've got anybody really dealing with the strategic communication element, which seems, it should all be based around, what to say, how to say it, who to say it to, in order to build coalitions, in order to take people with you, providing clarity, simple, accessible messaging. And it seems to be very complicated and complex. And I think if people like you and I are sort of struggling to wade through it, who live in or around politics, the general member of the public probably has no idea at all what's happening.
Your one piece of advice for Keir Starmer's comms team and Downing Street team as they and look to embark on the next potentially 4.5 years?
I think it's all about, three things: that sort of prioritisation, simplification, repetition. Build your comm structure, like what are our main goals, what are we trying to prioritise, breaking that down in the most accessible way possible, and then really getting out and selling it every opportunity you can so people really hear what you're trying to tell them. Let's
just start with the 2019 election being called. Did Labour and the Lib Dems really just hand you a huge win on the plate from the start? Because they voted for that election. They obviously both came out of that incredibly wounded. When that election was called, obviously it took a long time for it to actually get through Parliament with all the Fixed Term Parliaments Act and the shenanigans there. But Jeremy Corbyn was weak from the outset, right? He was a gift to you.
Well, that's what everyone thought in 2017. You've got to remember that this was the same guy that was heading up Momentum, the kind of party within the party in the Labour movement, that was, I think, in large part responsible for generating a huge amount of on-the-ground campaigning through a lot of these, very young, very left-wing activists. And in 2017, the same clueless policy platform, the same history of anti-Semitic comments. That guy very, very nearly cost us the election, and there was no guarantee that the same wouldn't happen again. We went into the 17 election confident. We went into the 19 election confident. 2017, that confidence was not rewarded at the ballot box. In 2019, it was. So it was important not to take anything for granted and not to just write him off as like magic grandpa, as some people, both in the Labour Party and in the Conservative Party, tried to do.
And the manifesto was seen as, I think, a bit dull at the time. I think people sort of wanted to see it as trying to avoid a rinse and repeat of the 2017 dementia tax manifesto. Was that a strategy that you went into that election with, that sort of safety first, strong sort of get Brexit done message, which we heard again and again? Was that a deliberate sort of strategy? How did you approach this campaign from the start as chairman?
So, of course, you got to, again, the 2017 general election cast a long shadow. And the fact is, when we spoke to people in the intervening years between the 17 and the 19 general election, the thing that came up over and over again was the fact that despite the British people saying they wanted to leave the EU, we had still not left the EU, and it was looking increasingly like we might not ever leave the EU. And that eclipsed almost everything else. And therefore, our campaign, and to a large extent our manifesto, needed to reflect the concerns of the British people. It was the anger, the frustration of the British people. It was
so frustrating, visceral. Reporting on it, seeing it, protests every week, MPs in, chaos, deadlock.
Yeah.
And you guys had to respond to that by just saying, we're the ones that are going to get it done.
And everything, and the other point is that the failure up until the 2019 general election to deliver Brexit then distorted every other conversation. Every conversation about home affairs, distorted by Brexit. Conversations about trade policy, distorted by Brexit. Conversations about any other policy area kept gravitating back to Brexit.
Boris Johnson knew that you couldn't do anything else unless he
you couldn't even talk about it. It's not just what you could do. You couldn't even talk about anything else. And so it was unsurprising that that became the dominant issue. And therefore, the focus of so much of the campaign was to make sure that there was genuine belief that Boris and the Conservatives would deliver Brexit. That was the first thing, and that the parliamentary party would back him in that delivery of Brexit. And that meant a whole load of front of house stuff in terms of the messaging, in terms of the focus, but also a lot of the behind the scenes stuff with candidate selection to say, look, this civil war over Brexit has got to stop. And that was the kind of message, behind the scenes stuff, to make sure that we could deliver on our explicit promise to the British people.
And what are your main memories of 2019 now? Like, I think about it, Donald Trump visiting in the middle of NATO. We did have a terror attack halfway through. That Love Actually advert, which I've spoken about with Ben Guerin, and some of those viral moments. Jeremy Corbyn's NHS dossier. What are your sort of main memories of 2019?
So my personal memories is the massive inability to get enough sleep. When you're the party chairman, you have the very, very, very early morning meetings ahead of the breakfast media rounds that were happening every day, doing the overnight polling analysis, making sure that we are keeping the messaging tight. Whoever's fronting up the Conservative messaging on that day, whatever the visits are, that's all done very, very early in the morning. And quite often I was travelling around the country until quite late at night, doing regional media, motivating the troops on the ground, and then plugging in each morning to these, either virtually or physically, through these coordination meetings first in the morning. So the thing that I take away is just physical exhaustion.
Any highlights? Was there a moment where you thought, that's it, we've won it? Did that ever happen? Or were you always thinking in the back of your minds, Jeremy Corbyn might be about to become Prime Minister?
So the exit poll was the first time. The exit poll was the first time that I properly felt I could relax.
Where were you when that came in?
I was at the Sky News studios, if I remember rightly. John Bercow was also one of the guest panellists, if I remember rightly. And I think when the exit poll came out, I looked across at his face, and the face that he pulled, that I will always remember.
I remember seeing some of those pictures, and I remember seeing some of the pictures of Boris Johnson and Carrie Johnson, and the scenes of Number 10, that absolute jubilation on their faces when they realised that they got it. So you never had any of that moment. You were always thinking, in the back of your head, this could go either way.
You've got to plan for the worst. You've got to put in the hard yards to make sure the things that didn't go right in 17 did go right in 19. And I knew that if things went badly, as the chairman of the Conservative Party, that I would share a large part of the blame for that. Obviously, the Prime Minister would, Boris would, but so would I. And you've got that shadow. You've constantly got that shadow of what if the worst happens. So that's why you stay up late and get up early and work very, very hard to try and avoid that and maximise the chance of success. And we saw in the 2017 that the exit poll was very, very accurate in a heartbreaking way. And when the exit poll came out the exit poll came out in 2019, and it was the case of, like, we've got this. It
turned out to be incredibly accurate, of course.
Very accurate.
Isn't it truth, though, that obviously Nigel Farage really did hand the Tories that victory? They didn't stand any candidates in those Tory areas, which really did allow the Conservatives to be the only party that was saying we're actually going to vote to leave the EU. And aren't we now sort of seeing that, now that he's come back, now that the Reform Party's come back? We are seeing the fruits of that come out in British politics today.
So I had conversations with senior people, those who were backing the then Brexit Party. They came to me and they said, "You got to do a deal with us." And I said, "We don't do deals. We're not going to do a deal." And they said, "Well, in which case we'll stand candidates and you won't get a majority." And I said, "Well, if you do that, then people will see that you supported a Labour leader staying, as Labour leader, who's got a terrible track record. I don't think that's what the country wants. I don't think that's what you want. And if you're saying that you will actively do stuff to prevent the delivery of Brexit, which you claim is your great motivator, then I don't know how you'd reconcile that internally, how you'd sell that to the British people." So
you were never tempted to actually do a formal deal with the Brexit Party with Nigel Farage?
No. Because, look, you've got to make your case. You've got to make your case. And they would have to go into the general election making the case as to why they were doing something which would credibly either delay or perhaps permanently prevent our exit from the European Union. Now, that's their problem. That's reconciling themselves to the implications of standing candidates or whatever. That was up to them. My job was to get our candidates selected, to help make sure that we structured and delivered our message, and to make sure that, having won the election, we were actually in a position where we could deliver on our promise to cut through all the delay, cut through all the argument, cut through all the parliamentary wrangling, and actually get Brexit delivered. That was my job. Let them get on with theirs.